So the dictionary is a collection of commonly used words with short definitions and some pronunciation guides that might work for you if you're in a certain part of the country, of America. And already you see my bias. This video is going to go over some practical drawbacks of dictionaries, some criticisms of people who depend on their words, maybe how to properly use the dictionary, and then I'm going to go through a couple of big concepts that the dictionary really screws up. And if people were more intellectually honest or curious, they would not depend on the dictionary. So dictionaries used to be in books that you would print out, but they would come out with a new one every year depending on what new words were out. Like, usually people didn't even realize that until the dictionary announces that it's gonna add selfie to it. Or G-poi. I don't know, is G-poi still in the dictionary? I don't actually have a dictionary, but I do have one that I can borrow, so let's just make some space. I'm holding this instead of a cat. This is Webster's Universal Dictionary Unabridged. It is not mine. I've borrowed it. It is very old. I am afraid I will break it, and I don't want someone to be mad at me. The dictionary is a very surface level attempt at a definition of words that we randomly use. It's time for a millennial reference where I was taught to look things up in the dictionary and then in the encyclopedia being a somewhat thicker version of the dictionary where it would go into several pages of description sometimes depending on the topic. And that would then reference other materials that you should go and look up in order to further understand something. Of course, the other drawback to being a printed book and a physical media is that you can lose a lot of time trying to figure something else based off the dictionary. It's also kind of hard to find a word. You can spend tens of minutes combing through the dictionary trying to figure out if a word starts with a C or a K or a J for some reason. You can be looking for something for a long time if you're not 100% familiar with it. And yet, there is a dearth of YouTube internet videos where people will go off the dictionary definition for the rest of their video and depend on that and not have any genuine curiosity. This is the worst thing in film criticism, where they try to use the dictionary definition of an art analysis word in order to talk about a piece of media. And maybe that's some dumb shit. Whenever I call people out on this, on their video, like maybe you should use an art criticism definition of that word in order to make your video not suck, I get very long paragraphs where people eventually tell me because they don't wanna. You could just say you don't want it, you lazy piece. The dictionary is only really good for a suggestion of how to pronounce a word and the spelling, and a couple of times it gets the spelling wrong. Though this is more of an exception proves the rule. In the description there's a link to an article talking about how how grammar and spelling is used to boost white supremacy. So that's fun. Oh man, this is the fun section of the video. I don't have music playing like IRL, and well, I do. It's in my headphone, but I definitely won't be able to beat match this, so it's gonna look bad no matter what. And a deep understanding of some subjects is extremely necessary. For example, For example, the person who really got my goat with this is the streamer and debater Destiny, who can't tell the difference between Karen, which is a white woman who calls the police on a black person or goes to the manager in order to demand better service. The internet is slowly eroding that definition through use of being incorrect all the time. But Destiny can't tell the difference between Karen and the N-word, which I can't even say. And Destiny thinks that maybe Karen is as bad as the N-word. Because Destiny does not have an understanding of fucking anything. And Destiny goes to the dictionary for his definition of racism. So Destiny does not take racism in account when it comes to whether or not you should say the N-word. And thus, he doesn't have an understanding of whether or not he should use Karen. a word used to describe a white woman using her privilege in order to get a black person shot and discriminated against by the police. Destiny is a Karen. Implicit in it is that the Karen does not naturally think that calling the police on this person that is bothering her will get them shot, unless she's a real piece of shit. But she is ignorant of her privilege and the privilege of the police, by default believing the complaints of a white woman and taking it out on black people. Karens, unless they're real pieces of shit, again, do not understand racism and their own privilege and systematic forces that discriminate against black people. Destiny's kind of a Karen, and I understand that not everyone has time reading a textbook, reading economic, what's that word? Educational? Reading philosophy and scholaristic? Scholartastic? God, I wish the dictionary could tell me that. Scholastic writing is not for everyone, and it's actually super annoying. There's a lot of emotional labor that goes into understanding these kind of things, and there's like a way you have to change your mind in order to read scholarly writing, which I understand. But you think if someone hasn't done the reading and hasn't done the research, then they wouldn't argue about something and would just listen to people who have. But not on the internet. Everyone's entitled to throw out their opinion with no consequences. Ah, yay! I don't love it. I've read scholarly writing and philosophy, and it is super annoying. It does kind of suck. There's a couple of things you have to change your mindset when reading something. Capitalist realism is one of the most approachable pieces of scholarly writing, and it holds some things down. But there is definitely a very scholarly version of this that is 4 times as long. And that's because when you read pure scholarly writing, it will start with a statement that it wants to prove. But then that entire first chapter will be defining the words in that statement. And this is important because definitions do matter. But the thing is about scholarly writing is everyone's definition can be a little bit different depending on what aspect of the words they're trying to explore. And it's okay. This is okay. This is actually very good for scholars in order to know what they're talking about. A lot of the fighting on the internet is solely because of people using different definitions, different worldviews, and different ideologies in order to interpret the words that they're using to fight with one another. Which is why it can be helpful to stop a conversation and define a word. Because on the internet, definitions can be very weaselly because we have a bunch of people slamming together with ideologies, and we have right-wing rhetoric that often full sail takes rhetoric of the left and criticisms of the left, cuts off any all ties and definitions that they once has, and slowly ruins the word. Reddit is a den of sin where words go to die. And also 4chan. I hate those fucking websites. I hate them more than Facebook. And they're not forever. I swear, 3 to 10 drone strikes will take care of all of those terrible websites that I hate. Capitalism is not a word. Capitalism is an ideology, and it has, over the years, slowly lost meaning and become vaguer and vaguer and vaguer. Also, it was a word invented by Karl Marx. He named capital. He gave capitalism its name. And many may think that this is a very old, and it is very old, but they might think that maybe it doesn't apply to our economy, which is funny to me, right? Because people will still use some of the writing of classical economic theory, like from Thomas Paine and older stuff, to describe why economics are the way they are. But then they'll try to throw out Marx, which is newer than Thomas Paine, which was some writing that inspired the founding of America. Fighting about economics on the internet is terrible because of the dictionary, or hold on to that little thing. You don't have to blame the dictionary. We don't have to blame you. But essentially, Marx's Capital were several volumes of a book all meant to define capitalism. And Marx's writing inspired other people to disagree with it, apply it, think about it, expand on it, and there's a lot of economic writing that has spawned from Marx. Spawned? And just to hit the point home, why would someone depend on 3 sentences to define something when entire volumes of scholarly lore are used in order to understand and actually not always understand a topic and subject? Kick that question down the road. But there are modern economic theories and modern homes. Not everyone is Keynesian anymore. From, I think, the 1950s, 1930s. Modernly, there is modern monetary theory, which makes several observations about how our economy seems to work. And with modern monetary theory, we can understand some newer aspects of our economy that was not predicted in Marx, and that classic economics does not cover, understand, and should be impossible. One such impossible thing, by May, during our coronavirus epidemic outreach, the United States government created $8 trillion that did not exist before. They were not taxed. They came from the government, and the government spent that $8 trillion on the economy, on banks, directly to the stock market, and then directly to corporations, and then a small part of it went to the citizens of the United States. The government spent $1,200 on me personally that did not exist at all before. This isn't in Marx's Capital, per se. It doesn't have money existing from nowhere. Non-compete talks about modern monetary theory in length. If you're curious about why and how a government can just spend $8 trillion that didn't exist before, check out his video. But in his video, he also talks about how modern monetary theory has limited itself to only observing the features of our current government and monetary policy. It doesn't go through the understanding, and actually several economists actively ignore and do not know and avoid the writings of Marx when it understands several aspects that modern monetary theory does not. And modern monetary theory in several ways can complement that which Marx wrote, because modern monetary theory focuses on government spending and actually doesn't apply to state money spending or small country spending that don't have the unique qualities of the United States government when it comes to money. I should say the United States federal government. States have their own budget according to the video. It's actually really good, and thank you, the bottom of the screen. You'll see. So Marx's Capital is huge. You can't see it, e-reader. But several curious things that I've observed when going through scholarly writing from Marx and other people is that their entire work goes for a definition. This entire book is justifying and defining what capitalist realism is. They are defining the things around the word in order to paint a full picture of what it is. So here's the table of contents. This is probably the worst way to do this. Does that show up? It does kind of show up. But there are parts, chapters, and then sub-chapters for things. And the first 3 parts of Capital are all about commodities. What they are, how are they created, how they relate to the worker. Let's go through some of these. Commodities and money, the 2 factors of commodity use value and value, the twofold character of the labor embedded in commodities, the form of value or exchange value of commodities, the fetishism of commodities, and the secrets thereof. Oh, whew, secrets time. That's just, chapter 1. Chapter 2 is all about exchange. Chapter 3, money and the circulation of commodities. Part 2 the transformation of money into capital, the general formula for capital, Part 3, the production of absolute surplus value, the labor process and process of producing surplus value, the labor process or productions of use value. Chapter 8, constant capital and variable capital. Chapter 9, the rate of surplus value. Section 1, the degree of exploitation of labor power. This is a list. Now, sorry for listing. Quick aside, the dictionary is a glorified lists. And another reason why the dictionaries suck is because lists suck. And I just realized that while reading the contents of Capital that I was listing things for you, which should have made your eyes glaze over. And you need to fight that when it comes to scholarly writing and understanding stuff. And how you fight that is you get a question in your mind. And the question in the mind should be given to you by the book or the title. Such as Marx's Capital, you should be thinking, what is capital and how is the thing he's telling me right now relate to capital? So Marx starts out by telling us what commodities are. Commodities being physical things, books, e-readers, clothes, haircuts. A haircut is a service. But how are services commodities? Marx goes over them. He talks about commodities and the relation to the workers. Workers make a commodity and get paid a wage. And Marx breaks down what wages are. Like a ransom, where someone will make $400 worth of furniture in a day over 7 hours, over 8 hours, but then they'll only be paid $200 for the hours that they worked. This is a complete guess. It's just throwing that out there. But while you're hearing all of these things, you should be asking yourself, what is capitalism? What is Das Kapital? What are you talking about, Mr. Marx? The other thing is, if definitions aren't short, like they are in the dictionary, they're very boring, and all of capital actually reads like a definition. So I'd like to also reference right now a beginner's guide to Das Kapital, a video review by Radical Reviewer, or you just pick up the book, and in it they go over this thing. They go over everything. But in Capital is a very heavily proofed argument for what capitalism is. And what it ends up being, capitalism is the exploitation of the worker where the excess value from their commodities get paid up a ladder in order to make the ownership of the means of production, of the means of producing commodities, going to one or a few people that will be extremely rich through no labor of their own. And if someone has a bad definition of capitalism, when we have conversations about changing the mode of capitalism or talking about how capitalism is bad at one thing or another, they may associate capitalism with commerce, with money. Part 2, Chapter 4, the transformation of money into capital. Marx writes, the starting point of capital, the production of commodities, their circulation, and that more development from their circulation called commerce. So Marx lays the groundwork with defining money, defining labor, defining commerce, and it all builds up to an argument of what things are, slowly giving you definitions and painting what things are, because Marx in Capital is saying all this stuff for nearly the first time. He's referencing other scholars' work, but a lot of it is his own independent thought of what happens and redefining these terms and giving us several of these words for the first time ever, giving us a total picture of what our economic system, from feudalism to the weird period of experimentation to capitalism, is and has become. Because Marx was very interested in the French Revolution and what things came out of the French Revolution. So Marx is dating back with a lot of history. Feudalism was one person and several lords owning all of the land of the country, and everyone that didn't own the land was a peasant, and they worked the land for the lord. Throughout the medieval period, the feudal era, there were certain artisans that came out, people that would make and sell their own work. That's where we get blacksmiths, painters started to come up, people that would make something that is all their own and then sell that so that they can then continue their lives. They were artisans, a middle class of commerce, first appearing because they found a different way to apply their labor. Imperialism took off from feudalism. It was still one country where there was a few owners, but then they would take over land in companies in order to profit from the raw resources. This is the imperial age. Imperialism, a shade different from feudalism, but still everything going up to the divine right of kings. This is where we see slavery really start to take off because cheap labor. You can't tell a free white man to pick cotton because picking cotton is terrible. Any self-respecting white man, and they were like, no, forget that. I can just move north, grow tobacco in my yard, and live off the bountiful land because there's lots of deer and trees and shit. I'm not gonna pick your goddamn cotton. But slavery took a race of people, separated them out by their skin color, and set out this work for them to do because they're not allowed to work anywhere else. And that's how slave economies worked under colonialism. And then some people got very wealthy, but most of the wealth went to the king. And at the time of writing Das Kapital, slavery being over was a new thing. It was before Jim Crow, but after the Civil War. And the communist parties, communist and socialist used interchangeably, their ideas came through in America in order to support workers and such, and ended practices like child labor, because they saw it as wrong, and super exploitation, and slavery. A lot of early abolitionists were communists. So then when we come to Capital, Das Kapital, Marx has all of these things in his head and all of these writing that he's done to fight for one side, and now he's describing what has happened in a post-slavery world in order to make people continue to do that hard labor work instead of going off and living off the land. And he's taking these ideas, these artisans, commerce, money, and hierarchies, and seeing how they interplay, reacts in order to keep a hierarchy in existence. Just because you're not a king, under capitalism, the person with the most money has the most power and can make other people do what they want. But how? That's explained when money gets turned into capital. The circulation of commodities is the starting point of capital. The production of commodities, their circulation, and that more developed form of their circulation called commerce, these form the historical groundwork from which it rises. The modern history of capital dates from the circulation of the 16th century of a world-embracing commerce and a world-embracing market. This final product of the circulation of commerce is the first form in which capital appears. As a matter of history, capital, as opposed to landed property, invariably takes the form first of money. The first distinction we notice between money that is only money and money that is capital is nothing more than the difference in their forms of circulation, how they are spent out in the world. The transformation of commodities into money, that's bread into money, and the changing of that money back again goes into commerce. You have a commodity, you sell it for money so that you can buy commodities. Making things so that you can live. This is selling in order to buy. The transformation comes in money, commodity, money. The transformation of money into commodities and the change of commodities back again into money. They are buying in order to sell. There is a difference there between those two things. We also call that investment. You don't think about how you invest your time at your place of work in order to get money. Well, you can. You can think about how you invest your time in a place you work in order to get money. But this process divorces you from the work thing. The thing you did for work does not matter. It is not a thing that actually helps you. The money that you get helps you. The wage you get helps you. And you are divorced and divided from that thing that you do. In the same way, though, capital, money spent to make more money, is divorced from the people that make that money. So if someone buys a bakery, it's the bakers that bake everything. And it's the bread that is sold to people. But the baker is not given the full price of the bread. And the person who owns the company did not do any work to make the bread to give to the people. but he gets all of the money, the capital from it, and he can use that to further invest into other things and make himself richer. And we in America have seen this thing to be good and normal, that you should always want more money. But depending on who you are, Marx starts at the view of the bottom person to show that this is dishonest. The capitalist, in order to make more capital, is stealing value from the worker that people have put their life into. The investment of the worker is downplayed in order for the capitalist to get more and more money, and they don't care about the worker. And thus, we've created a whole system of laws and trade telling people they can't live off the land. You have to own it. You have to own a thing in order to profit from it. Your work doesn't matter. Never mind that the land could be just sitting there, could be tilled to make food for you to eat. If someone else owns it, they have the right to waste it. Now, there's a level of understanding to all of this that is better explained by America Johnson and better explained by Radical Reviewer because they take time to explain it. But none of this is explained in the dictionary. And when explaining or trying to explain these sort of things, you need a deep understanding of it. And if you're arguing it from a view of the dictionary again, then you can think that capitalism could be anything. Capitalism is when you exchange money for goods. That's not commerce. We already have a word for that. That's commerce. Capitalism is when you invent something that's a need. Capitalism is when you have money. I'm a capitalist because I have money. No. You work for your money in order to live. Now, it's not the dictionary's fault alone that this is happening, because this erasure of definition of curiosity, instead of thinking about how things work and how to make it better, we think this is the way it needs to be, and this is the best. This is called, partially, capitalist realism. In capitalist realism, Mark Fisher is building off of the work of Marx. Marx had several predictions that people would see the strings of what's going on and they would revolt. And several people did, but we are still in a capitalist system. In fact, every country in the world now participates in capitalism. It is an assumed, it is background noise. It is not seen as ideology anymore. It is the erasure of everything, in a sense. Mark Fisher in Capitalist Realism is defining what capitalist realism is. The point of taking entire scholarly work in order to illustrate a term is to understand the world around us. So capitalist realism, in a way, is, like I said, how we don't see capitalism anymore. The other thing it is how capitalism makes everything a commodity. From rebellion to socialism to fighting against the system is now commoditized. There are commercials where Pepsi has a protester give a Coke away in order to sell more commodities. But the structure of capitalism only exists to keep those unfair equations in there, because you have to keep people working for a wage instead of just living for themselves, providing for themselves, or even us providing for each other. So capitalism has to have ways of keeping itself going, and that way is capitalist realism. Mark Fisher starts off this quote by going through Marx, and I thought that was good, so we're going with it. We're in the middle of defining realism as opposed to the art movement of what realisms are. Capitalist realism is therefore not a particular type of realism, it is more of a realism in itself, as Marx and Engels themselves observed in the Communist Manifesto, written before Das Kapital. And also, not heavy theory, it's more of a billboard, an advertisement for what the Communist Party is trying to do. Capital has drowned the most heavenly ecstasies of religious fervor, of a chivalrous enthusiasm, a Philistine sentimentalism, in the icy water of egotistical calculation. It has resolved personal worth into exchange value, and in place of the numberless, indefensible, chartered freedoms, it has set up a single unconditional freedom, free trade. In one word, for exploitation. Veiled by religious and political illusions, it has substituted naked, shameless, direct, brutal exploitation. Capitalism is what is left when beliefs have collapsed at the level of ritual or symbolic elaboration, and all that is left is the consumer spectator trudging through the ruins of the relics. Capitalism is defended with a fervor not dissimilar to millennial again, the 2010s, 2007 to 2010 religious atheist debates, where atheists would say a random thing and then Christians would go out of their way to defend it. That exact thing has happened, but with capitalism. Like if someone says the coronavirus, for example, killed over 100,000 people. In Vietnam, it killed 0 people because the government was able to respond in an adequate way to the threat and help people. The point of the government is to protect and help the people and its citizens. In America, capitalist interests have surpassed, maybe even capitalist interests and world interests have taken up. Maybe I should just say this later. They go further into this idea in chapter 2. Of course they do. Every chapter is going to go further into it. The whole idea of the book is to explain the concept. It is impossible to conceive of fascism or Stalinism without propaganda, but capitalism can proceed perfectly well, in some ways better, without anyone making a case for it. Zizek's counsel here remains invaluable. If the concept of ideology is the classic one in which the illusion is located in knowledge, Zizek argues, then today's society must appear post-ideology. The prevailing ideology is that of cynicism. People no longer believe in ideological truth. They do not take ideological positions seriously. The fundamental level of ideology, however, is not of an illusion masking the real state of things, but that of an unconscious fantasy, structuring our social reality itself. And at this level, we are, of course, far from being post-ideological in our society. Cynical distance is just one way to blind ourselves from the structural powers of ideological fantasy. Even if we do not take things seriously, even if we keep an ironic distance, we are still doing them. That's the end of the Zizek. Capitalist ideology in general, Zizek maintains, consists precisely in the overvaluing of belief, in the sense of inner subjective attitude, the expense of belief we exhibit and externalize in our behavior. So long as we believe in our hearts that capitalism is bad, we are free to continue to participate and exchange in capitalism. In this section, he's describing people that support the way things are, that have a cynical distance from things, support capitalism, but even the people who disagree with capitalism and want to change it, as long as they disagree, they can still participate in it. This is capitalist realism. Both sides are working for capitalism. This is in part why Marxist revolution hasn't happened, because capitalism, in how it functions with a hierarchy, with the levers of power, with how normalized everything is and how coercive it is in our lives, has made it so that even people rebelling and pushing against it work with capitalism. And it is very hard to escape these things. And Mark Fisher is making us ask this question of, how do the things I do reflect on capitalism and subvert it? Or how does everything I do play into capitalism? Of course, part of this structure is in forcing a hierarchy so that everyone has their place and everyone can do their thing. The only real freedom we have in our system is, what do we consume? How do we support the system? In the quote from the Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels are grieving for the loss of freedom. We don't have the freedom to live off the land. We don't have the freedom to become an artisan. We don't have the freedom to, fuck off all day unless you have money. And money, capital, is how you choose to participate in the system overall. Capitalism has destroyed freedom. Mark Fisher expands, capitalism has destroyed subversion of capitalism. But there are ways to escape capitalist realism. They're old and simple and basic ways. Angie Speaks touches on it in her video, God, I forgot the title because I'm not saying off the top. Mendukin? Angie speaks that several things that she consumed instilled values in her and spoke to her changing her ideology and seeing the strings in the world. Namely, noted socialist Alan Moore in his book Jerusalem, wherein they take the magical beliefs of old and expand on them in how we relate to the land and to the things around us and the people around us. There are ways to escape capitalist realism in art and in community that don't have to serve the needs of capital, the needs to put more wealth into the system and make someone else rich. It's not a disagreement, and it doesn't disprove capitalist realism. Capitalist realism mainly made us ask the correct question and showed us the right strings of the world, of our systems. The other big thing that the dictionary is fucking up for us is our understanding of racism. Now, as a general rule, which I do hate, but general rules. If you want to have an understanding of a topic, you need to go to something that actually understands the topic. The dictionary is not a socio-political book of study. It is not that kind of scholarship. If you want to understand racism, you have to look at race theory. You have to look at economic theory. You have to look at cultural and socio-political theory. A definition that is not about any of those things is bad and can just tell you how to spell the word, maybe how to pronounce it. In Afko's book, Racism as Zoological Witchcraft, the entire book is defining racism, but racism, like Mark Fisher defining capitalist realism, as its own term. The entire book is to define zoological witchcraft. Racism as Zoological Witchcraft, a Guide to Getting Out, where it talks about the movie Getting Out, so it's the best. Afko is a black vegan, and she fights for all of those causes, and her book Zoological Witchcraft is exploring how all of these causes are connected under capitalism. In her glossary of terms, she does not define racism because the entire book is about defining racism. So what does she define in her terms? Well, she defines Afrofuturism, Afro-zoological resistance, animality, decolonial, Eurocentric, intersectionality, minoritized, social layerism, another of her terms, speciesism, transmogrified, veganism, white supremacy, and zoological racism, which she says is a more descriptive term to capture the way that racism is maintained by the human-animal binary. Within this setup, white supremacy is both anti-black and anti-animal. By white supremacy, do I mean to allude to only the self-conscious racism of white supremacist hate groups? I refer instead to a political, economic, and cultural system in which whites overwhelmingly control the power and material resources, conscious and unconscious ideas. Both of these are conscious and unconscious ideas of white supremacy and entitlement and widespread relationship of white dominance and non-white subordination are daily reenacted across a broad array of institutional and social settings. Social layerism refers to ways in which intersectional activists and scholars often pile oppression on top of one another without an intersection or connection ever taking place. Minoritized. Rather than using the term minority, minoritized is a term that demonstrates the way in which minorities are actively in the process of being minoritized. It's a verb, whereas minority is a noun. Minoritized puts the onus on the systems that harm those with less power. This next one ties it well back to Marx. Decolonial, a theoretical framework that is interested in deconstructing, undoing, and unlinking Eurocentric ways of understanding the world. Decoloniality is the energy that does not allow the operation of logic of coloniality, or believes the fairy tales of rhetoric of modernity. Decolonial thinking is thinking that delinks and opens to the possibilities hidden by the modern rationality that is mounted and enclosed by categories of Greek, Latin, and 6 modern imperial European languages. Animality. Animality extends beyond literal non-human bodies and serves as a construction that cuts across race, gender, class, and reveals the structures of power anchored in the human. Now, the reasons why zoological witchcraft and capitalist realism honestly aren't that long and are pretty short books is because they reference larger materials that are about specifically defining those words. That's why it goes back to Marx and Das Kapital. That's why it goes back to the Communist Manifesto, because the Communist Manifesto has roots in other languages, in other works with other definitions to build on each other. Capitalist realism is assuming that the works referenced by Zizek, by Marx, and Engels are their framework for understanding the world. And you have to go back and at least have a cursory knowledge of each of them, or else take them by their word in order to understand them. And if you don't have to take their definition at face value, because it references older work. You can go and see where the work was done and disagree with that or not, or else learn. Now, I got this idea from AFCO, which I then applied to capitalist realism, that AFCO does not give any solid recommendation, any practical things for what to do. In this book, I do not offer practical step-by-step solutions. Sometimes teaching people how to ask the right question is part of the solution. For the incurious, or the people who have bought into capitalist realism and simply want to be non-ideological with their definitions, with their worldviews, the dictionary is a bastion, because the dictionary looks authoritative. It's big, it's impressive, it covers a lot of stuff. If you challenge their worldview, you're not just trying to expand things or fix a problem. You are challenging the dictionary, the authority on what things are. Now, I could call these people a lot of names. I've called them incurious and lazy, but not all of them, because we are taking part in several hierarchies. These people are taking cues from thought leaders, from validation gangs, outlined by Peter Coffin, of what to think and what to say and how to use this argument. And those thought leaders may be lazy or dumb. They may also be evil and know exactly what they're doing. They may know that actual economic definitions for things might be necessary to understand what we're doing and what they need to do. The best way to dismantle capitalism is to describe it as what Marx did. Like when Tucker Carlson's show was originally canceled after someone went on his show and described what his show was, of billionaires paying him to go on and say racist propaganda. His show got canceled. And Tucker Carlson's new show is also billionaires paying him to go on the television and spread white supremacist lies. He'll point to problems in our system, but his solutions are white supremacist. His solutions are bad, because he's a white supremacist. He's against actual groundswell concern of community. That's why these people don't give a shit about modern art. They give a shit about white supremacy. That is AFCO's definition of white supremacy. And we play into it too. The hierarchy is more than just an ideological enforcement. It's also a physical enforcement. Every major civil rights freedom has been fronted by minoritized people. Every major development in civil rights, in our rights being expanded, school lunches, has had communists, and specifically black communists, behind them, and black socialists behind them. Defunding the police is a fantastic call as a step to eventually abolish the police. The police are a physical enforcement of hierarchy that keeps people poor, that makes people stay in their place, that keeps people from taking what they need, that keeps people punished for being poor and sends them to prison where their labor is exploited by the state for free in our last giant bastion of slavery, where they are dehumanized because they are criminals, so they don't deserve freedom. And we spend billions of dollars on the police in order to keep that happening. AFCO in her book does not go over how to decriminalize the police, because we don't need the how, we need the question. And when the questions happen, when the questions are clear and direct, the people follow the cause. The Black Lives Matter from the last 3 weeks that took over Capitol Hill, Autonomous Zone, that burned down several police stations, that forced the structures and powers that be to scrutinize police behavior and charge several police, but not the police that murdered Breonna Taylor, all happened because everyone has this question on their mind. And when solidarity protests started popping up around America, the police let their bad apples through and showed that it's more than bad apples, they run a bad job that enforces a hierarchy, that minoritizes people. And all around the country, they hurt over 100 journalists, breaking one of our freedoms, the freedom of the press. And there is no one to blame in the side of Black Lives Matter, in the side of the people protesting against the police, because they no longer have leaders. In order to be able to tell the protesters not to do something, they'd have to be organized and under control. This is a double-sided sword. There's one, you can do a lot more with a smaller group of people if you're well organized and have a plan and a goal. Black Lives Matter, or the protests, the revolts that are happening right now, are a lot of people pushing hard on the system, tiring out police, getting them to quit, telling them to be defunded. But then there is a sway of taking down statues, which is, as Matt Crispin points out, a very good team building exercise. And also, Confederate statues are kind of shit because they're just rewriting history and propaganda piece, and they're all hollow and ugly, and they're all meant only there to minoritize the people that look at it, to tell you you're in your place and we have the power. And it feels good to take down some of those shitty, awful, ugly statues, which are the most boring part of any. But that isn't the real systematic change. They'll buy a new statue. Someone else will put a thing there. Feels good in the moment, but it is not attacking the structure like defunding would be. And this isn't a criticism. I'm not saying we should keep those statues, because fuck those statues. It's that we need to keep asking the question of how do we escape capitalist realism? How do we stop enforcing the hierarchy that minoritizes people? How do we keep in mind that we are more than a simple definition? Because there are people and forces that keep people ignorant and keep people dumb and make people incurious in order to keep playing to the system. Now, the positive side to not having a leader is that once these forces and groups are able to share enough of these ideas to fix it, then they will go through and they will happen and they will spread among everyone in America that hears the message. And the conversation has turned from should we spend money on the police to reform them or do nothing to should we abolish the police, defund the police, reform the police. Doing nothing is not on the table. And taking out the police takes out a lever of power that keeps us in this strict hierarchy. Of course, the downside to having leaders is they can be killed, and they are. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated for trying to help poor people. All the original leaders of Black Lives Matter were assassinated, shot and left in burnt cars, mysteriously died. There's no leaders, there's no one to be assassinated. I've been reading The New Jim Crow, and one aspect of that I feel really plays against capitalist realism is she's saying as long as we reform and just keep theorizing about police, it will never get better. I get the strong impression that she's saying we need to revolt in order to turn away this new Jim Crow, in order to change the police. And that is what is happening and is wonderful, and we need to continue to do it, because in numbers we are safe. But the police are still seeking revenge against protesters, with pepper spray, with overwhelming force, pushing them down, being violent to commuters, beating people. They are a force that wants to feel self-important and wants to make people feel under them, and they are not. None of us are better than one another. I've been speaking very authoritatively. I've been making quotes. I called the dictionary a big piece of shit that sucks, because it does. But I don't know more than you. I'm not better than you. I'm in this system too. I work for a wage too. The downside to merely asking questions is if we keep it just to asking questions, we just keep posting on the internet, we don't go out and we don't do work, that we won't make things better and will only play into capitalist realism. To an extent, I am an artisan. I write fiction. I write books. I make these YouTube videos where I own the camera and the editing, and I put work into it, and I write it, and I do the research, which sometimes I hate, and I have to put it on a capitalist structure in order to get it to you. Now, I would appreciate if you left a comment. I appreciate you. I would appreciate giving a like, subscribing if you're not subscribed already. I do have a hard choice of what to do when we have a continued epidemic, and I am considering quitting my job in order to stay safe. And I would really appreciate it if you could support me on Patreon. I have a visual novel I'm working on. I have several stories for you to beta read. Some physical media that I'm not yet selling, but I'm prototyping that I would love words on. I have 2 rewards for people helping up, and I just really appreciate it. Yes, it's part of the system that we live in, but also it's subversive parts, because there's some little part of art that hopefully survives and inspires people, right? And that's what we're working on. But you don't have to give me money on my Patreon. I will let you do stuff for free and interact with me and talk about art, and I would love any and all interactions that would happen on Patreon altogether. Stay curious, stay safe, defund the police, abolish the ICE, resist capitalism. Thank you for watching.